Hello, and welcome to the Silly-meme-rillion, a rereading, where we go through the Silmarillion chapter by chapter as we reread it and present our hot takes on the latest and greatest of the First and Second Ages of Middle-earth. We're your hosts, Fern.
And I'm Vee, and we're here to take you on a wild ride that would probably make Tolkien roll over in his grave. Listener discretion advised.
No, really. Expect the Tolkien allegory debate, Melkor's bad taste in music, and something about elvish gods.
Still keen? Then grab your beverage of choice, kick back, and enjoy the chaos.
Okay, well, we are here. Welcome to the podcast. It would probably be a good idea for us to introduce ourselves and tell you a little bit about who we are, where we come from, and what we're doing here. Vee, do you want to go ahead? Who are you?
Who am I? I'm not really sure. I'm still trying to figure that out. Luckily, we have the Silmarillion to teach us some things about who we are, like every other Tolkien fan that exists. No, but really, I am from the United States. I don't really have much of a background in anything, but I'm a huge nerd when it comes to fantasy and video games. I love Lord of the Rings. I fell in love with it with the movies when they first came out in 2001. I read Lord of the Rings once and I never grew a personality. But yeah, that's enough about me. What about you? Where are you coming from?
So I'm originally from Southeast Asia and I now live in Europe. Basically my background is in like international politics with a focus on conflict, and I love to write and make music and research, and all of that really coalesces into how I experience Tolkien and also how I engage with his work and in fandom. I was introduced to Tolkien through the films as well, that I watched in 2004 when they had all come out already. Um, and I basically got to reading the books because of how exciting the world was, and my mom could already see that she was generating like a proto nerd in the house, so she just enabled it completely, giving me all of the Tolkien, all of the Lewis, everything. Just yeah, it was great.
We love that energy. Can you believe that I didn't know that Tolkien and the books existed until I was in middle school? Like, I think my dad like vaguely said like when I was like 5, 6, 7, however old I was when we had just watched the movies, they had just come out. He said something about reading the books when he was younger, but it never really like was in my head that there are books to read until I was like in 7th or 8th grade. And my teacher's like, okay, so we're gonna read The Hobbit. And you might know these characters from The Lord of the Rings. I'm like, huh?
Excuse me?
What was that? There's books? And then after that, I read everything.
Amazing. So, tell me a little bit about the Silmarillion. Like, when did you first read it? What sort of things can you remember from that time?
I read it, I think I was 14, maybe 15 years old. I read it once. I don't think I collected anything from it. I feel like I was just reading words with no comprehension as to what was going on at all. I remember that it was very hard in the beginning to get into. It was it was kind of difficult to read. There was a lot of words and phrases and stuff that I didn't really understand, and I felt like there wasn't a lot of context to them, at least to my 14-year-old brain, and that's kind of where I was at when I read the Silmarillion. So really, I don't remember much of anything besides maybe Fingolfin versus Morgoth and Glorfindel. But what about you? What is your experience with the Silmarillion that I already know some of and I love so much?
Oh, bless. Okay, so basically, I remember my mom gave me a copy of it like 2 years after I had first watched the Lord of the Rings films and read The Hobbit and had read Lord of the Rings, because I had gotten it for Christmas and I opened it and I totally thought it was the unfinished tales and I got really excited, and then I realized it wasn't, and then I had to like save myself at the last minute and go, "Oh yeah, and the Silmarillion, I love that too. What is it?" Because somehow I had heard about the unfinished tales, but not about the Silmarillion. But anyway, so I got it, and then I didn't touch it because I had gotten it when I was, I think, 9. So that was just no. You cannot read the Silmarillion when you're 9. It's like it's not possible. So I first like read it end to end when I was 16, I think. That was so that's what like yeah, nearly a decade basically. And I think like I remember hating the beginning. Do you
I feel like that's
I think it's
universal.
universal, exactly. With the Silmarillion and with Lord of the Rings, let's be real, most people you lose them in the first two chapters.
I don't know. This isn't a Lord of the Rings podcast, but they lost me around chapter Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings. I really liked the first two chapters, but the introduction to hobbits was a little difficult to read because it required the context of the hobbit.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. That's what I mean when I meant like the beginning of Lord of the Rings was like the introduction of the Hobbit. Yeah, because once you get into the story and like unexpected party, like that's like fun and cool and is like Bilbo Baggins and whatever being a complete nonsense fellow. But
You can say asshole. We said listener discretion advised.
no, I wasn't thinking of asshole. I was actually unable to pin down exactly the kind of like manic bastard that he is, and I was like
The manic bastard is better. Bilbo Baggins, the
manic
manic
bastard.
bastard that we love
We adore
deeply.
him.
This is not a slandering Bilbo Baggins
Uh-uh.
podcast. In fact, what is he even doing here? We're talking about the Silmarillion. I think this is a good segue into what exactly we're going to do with this podcast, with the Silmarillion.
Precisely. So basically what we are going to do is well, we're rereading it since both of us it's been I think pretty much 10 years or more since either of us have read it. And we're just going to kind of, go through the text, talk a little bit about what we're reading, drawing on our own experiences and sharing our thoughts essentially. Neither of us are like Tolkien scholars per se, so, you don't expect like, page numbered quotes from Verilyn Fleeger's Splintered Light. Like that's not happening from us. Sorry. Like we're just drawing on our own thoughts and our own experiences of Tolkien, of fandom, of the world, and sharing that with you. And maybe there's gonna be something interesting in that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important also that we're just drawing from the text. We are literally just going to take our thoughts from the Silmarillion. Maybe we've collected something along the way in our own other readings of Tolkien or scholarship or anything like that, but we're going to really try to dissect the text from what is written in the text. Um, we ain't pulling out home. We ain't pulling out any of the stops here.
Yeah, and I think like going off of that, it's also really important to acknowledge how much a lot of Tolkien's work tends to require context. And, sometimes there can be expectations that you will have that context when you're reading the text. Sometimes that's, even just within the community that's enforcing that. But it also happens like, for example, when you're reading Lord of the Rings, there are a lot of callbacks to the Silmarillion, and if you don't have the context of the Silmarillion, well, that can have different effects on readers. I don't know about you, V, but for me, like when I was reading that as a kid, like I did find it confusing, but for me, it kind of had the effect that these half-referenced myths that I didn't really understand kind of made the world magic because it seemed so much bigger than beyond what was just being actually like, elaborated on the page. But I know that that is not necessarily every reader's experience. How is it for you?
I am basically the exact opposite. Sometimes, like, all these references to different, elvish gods and elvish, like, happenings and the Numenorians and stuff like that, turned me off from the whole thing because I didn't understand what was going on. And it felt like I was missing something, which I was missing something. And, like, while I can add to the world building, I always really like to have context as to what I'm reading so I can fully understand it. And with a lot of Tolkien, you need additional reference works. And sometimes it's kind of sucks when the community expects you to have that. I think that's why we're speaking on this right now, is because we are going to go into the Silmarillion with just the Silmarillion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually goes really nicely into some of the initial thoughts we were having when we began our reread. The Silmarillion book begins with an introduction written by Christopher Tolkien, as well as a reproduction of a letter by Milton Waldman. Sorry, a letter to Milton Waldman by Tolkien. In the introduction, basically, one really interesting thing that was referenced is kind of like what we've been discussing, which is the idea of the Silmarillion as a fixed tradition in the universe of Middle Earth, right? So it kind of underpins everything in this universe throughout his entire life writing within it. So that means that whatever the reader's entry point into the universe, the Silmarillion and the events that are told therein form the backbone of everything that happens in the Lord of the Rings and that happens in the Hobbit. You can find echoes of it, like for example, you know, in the Hobbit, when they go to the Elven realm, they go to Mirkwood and they go to the Elven King's
Yeah.
halls. Yeah, and like how it's so vague and
Thranduil.
it's Thranduil, my baby, but they don't actually say that he's Thranduil in the book, right? And you don't actually really have context about it. And he makes all these references to like disagreements between like the elves and the dwarves, and it's really cool because when you have some sort of, I guess, deeper knowledge about the underpinnings of Middle Earth, you start to see the echoes of that in some of the events that happen in the Silmarillion in the Kingdom of Doriath, which we will get to eventually later in this podcast. But of course, it's presented completely differently in The Hobbit, right? The Hobbit is almost like a fairy tale, basically. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this. This really interesting way that the Silmarillion underpins just the entire universe of Middle Earth.
I mean, I think it's really cool, not only that like, I like it, I like the idea of it, I guess I don't like how a lot of times context is missing, but I think it's really cool how Tolkien kind of developed this idea throughout his entire life, and as he grew as a person, as he aged, so did his work. Like, the Silmarillion wasn't just one thing going on, and Christopher talks about that in his introduction. It was multiple things, and multiple points and stories actually ended up changing as Tolkien got older, before his death.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess like it's kind of reflected on the two sides, right? It's reflected in the way it changes in our world as in as him for the author, and also in the way that the Silmarillion gets presented in like the frame narrative of Middle Earth, right? Like the way that it's basically it comes in scraps, and you get that in the Lord of the Rings as well. These are supposed to be like, you know, the histories that get stuck into the back of the Red Book of Westmarch kind of thing. Like it's stuff that's added on and added on. And for me, like it reminds me of the way that myths get retold and transformed even in our world with like real world text, other mythologies, other epic poems. Like the one that I'm thinking off the top of my head is the Iliad. You know, because like it first gets written, it's like one of the oldest texts that we know, in the same way that the Silmarillion is like, you know, one of the oldest texts that they know. And the reality of it is like, you know, contentious. Did the Trojan War happen? Did it not happen? Well, there are ruins of Troy in the west of Turkey. So, but you know, the actual events with the gods and with Achilles and everybody is really interesting because it exists then, and then as history passes, it gets transformed at different moments, doesn't it? Like you have Alexander the Great and Hephaestion using the narrative of Achilles and Patroclus in their life. And then you fast forward, like, when was that? That was like 500 BC. You fast forward like 2,500 years. And then you have Brad Pitt and the Troy film, which has a completely different take on these two guys and on the Trojan myth in general. And oh, I just realized Orlando Bloom's in Troy as well. He's in Troy and in Lord of the Rings. And he has a bow in both of them. He
Yes,
shoots
doesn't
a
he play a
He's Paris.
he's Paris, right? He's Pretty Boy Paris.
Exactly. He's Pretty Boy Paris. And he shoots Achilles in the heel with an arrow.
He goes and, he, doesn't steal, uh Helen away. They are romantically together, and she goes with him. That was also very different.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Troy than in the Iliad, and then you keep going forward. Madeline Miller came out with a book, The Song of Achilles, which is basically entirely focused on Achilles and Patroclus's relationship, romantic relationship. It was like critically acclaimed, and you have classicists like still arguing about whether it was a romantic relationship at all, what really happened, the same way that, you know, you had Greek philosophers arguing the same thing. And it's really interesting to contextualize, you know, like that real life, um, uh, kind of evolution of a story, the same way the Silmarillion kind of evolves. And like, yeah, of course you have the elves who are there, they remember this stuff, but even in memory, you know, you forget, you embellish, you mix things around. Like, I refuse to believe that the elves are like these all-knowing creatures who are incapable of fault, because you know what? I've read the Silmarillion.
Yep. No such thing.
I think this is a good time to head into Tolkien's letter 131. I think you guys know this letter. This is the peak Tolkien apologia letter that exists, constantly facing it online. You will hear it wherever you go if you decide to break away from the. Uh, how would we describe this model of Tolkien that uses this letter at all times?
I would say that it's one that's very like prescriptivist. It basically says that this is how it is, and the author wrote it this way, and therefore any other approach to not just the stories in universe, but any like personal approach that you take to critiquing the work or critiquing the story gets invalidated, basically, because what he's done here is basically provide like a literary criticism of his own work, basically, right? It's a commentary on what he's created. um but, and I've said this so many times, but neither the author nor the reader is the sole arbiter of any truth. Both the author, like, the words are the words on the page. The author may have transmitted them, but the words are separate from his thought. And the moment they're on the page, they get divorced from that thought. And, you know, both the author and the reader will fill in meaning to those words. But I think what a lot of uh, people in the Tolkien community tend to do when they quote this letter is use this to basically say that the author's word is law, even though he himself is just doing what other readers do, which is providing criticism to a text that was created. And just because he's the creator, his understanding of the text, or his interpretation of it, is somehow seen as the be all and end all, which just that's I'm sorry, that's just not true. The moment a text is out in the world, is out of our hands, or it's out of the author's hands. I say our because I write as well. That's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, and to give a little bit more context on the letter in question, this is the British myth letter. This is where he describes how he wants to create a British mythology, an English mythology specifically, maybe discussing the language. And it says explicitly, this is not an allegory, which is a pretty contentious point in the community, especially because it does read like an allegory if you kill the author off.
I think it's something people need to be aware of at any time, like when they're talking to other fans who are, engaging with the work and interpreting it, because stories exist in the real world and are read with real people who have real experiences and real backgrounds, and the things that they're dealing with in their life, and that will 100% inform the way that they read the text. And you can't just wave a letter in front of them written by the author and say, okay, therefore your reading is invalid. That's just no. That's not how any kind of engagement with any creative piece of media goes. I don't think it's right in any sort of sense to say that.
It's become kind of like a sword and shield for this certain group of Tolkienites. They use it as a weapon to, halt diversive readings of Tolkien's work. And I really don't understand this intense need to, defend this author, defend his work. I think it's fun to criticize and critically analyze anything that anyone writes, because it's like one of the biggest engagements in scholarship and fandom.
Precisely, 100%. I think it's like, it's one thing to say that you love a text, but like, or to love a text or any piece of media. Um, but I don't think anybody would ever say in any aspect of life that loving something completely blindly is good. Like, what am I trying to say here? I'm just thinking of like even, real world like relationships with other people. If you love a person blindly, you don't see the flaws, you risk, hurting yourself or hurting others who are also in your vicinity, because you refuse to see the negative impacts that that person, or in this case the media, I'm making an analogy, I love it. um I'm making an allegory.
Got him.
Got him, letter, boom, done. But yeah, no, I think that's like, just to sort of bring that back to what we were saying, is that criticism is probably the best and richest way that we can engage with any media that we consume, and probably the healthiest way to do so as well. I understand people who just go into this for escapism. They just want to run away to Middle Earth for a while, and like that is totally fine. But I also think that that should not come with any sort of um, or it should not come with any expectation that you have to be it has to be hero worship and it has to be defensive at all levels, because people will engage with Tolkien in so many different ways depending on their interest and what drew them to the work in the first place, and how those interests evolve over time, whether they stay as casual fans who are just in it for the fun, or whether they want to talk a little bit more critically about it, if they even want to go into scholarship. Basically just like allow these doors to be open and allow people to walk through as many of these doors as they want to over the stretch of their life that they engage with Tolkien.
Yeah, I completely agree. You have me there. Do we want to talk about the whole British myth and how, at least within the context of this letter, again, not referencing any other thing Tolkien might have addressed about it, what kind of feelings does that give you? Like, what kind of thoughts do you have on that?
So yeah, when this letter talks about like Tolkien's intention to create some sort of mythic cycle for for England specifically, he talks about basically myths like the Arthurian cycle being tied up with the soil of Britain, but not with English, as in the English language, because King Arthur, like it has origins in French cycles as well, le mot d'Arthur. But the thing is that English, the language that he wants to base this off, there's only so much time you have to deal with English as it is spoken before it becomes other languages, because English, it's a hodgepodge of a whole bunch of different influences. And also, because he says that he's inspired by things like the Kalevala, which is the considered the Finnish national epic. But the thing is, like the Kalevala also isn't like some sort of like central point that has been informing this country's culture for like aeons and aeons. It's not some central mythic cycle that ties everything together. It's hugely important to Finland's culture and cultural history, but it was written in the 1800s. It was written in the 1800s as a compendium of like folklore. I believe it was primarily Karelian folklore, but again, I'm not a scholar, so I can't remember if it's only Karelian folklore. But still, it's a compendium and transformation of that, and it also has Christian influence, which is something that Tolkien also didn't like about the Arthuric cycle, and that he didn't want to explicitly involve it in in Middle Earth. But the thing is, even with the Kalevala, which it is a Christianized version of these indigenous myths of the country.
I also thought it was pretty interesting, and again, I'm not a scholar, but he talks about this idea of making a British myth, but he kind of pulls from a whole bunch of different other cultures that are not British to make this British myth. And you can see that very early on in the Silmarillion, even within the chapters that we are going over today. There's influence outside of the British Isles. And I think that's super interesting. How can you make something that's British if you're using stuff from other places?
100%. And like I think that basically, like, because he talks about this idea of unified mythology, right? And I think the thing is that these unified mythologies that he speaks of, they are just epics that capture a snapshot of a society's current, the way that they see their culture and their history and their beliefs. So you can't really have one of these unified mythologies that stands alone, because neither language nor culture is immutable. It changes, it draws an influence from other sides, and he is not immune to that. All of the things that he's experienced, as a classic scholar, as a linguist who's interested in the Anglo-Saxon tales, in Nordic legends, that will all be feeding into his work. And I think we're going to talk about some of that when we get into the chapters. Um, but yeah, and I guess just to kind of wrap this up is just one final thought about the idea of this being something tied to the English language. And I think that's really important because English tends to be one of the main ways that Tolkien fans become exposed to the work, either through the films that they watch in English or the books that they read in the first language, in the original language, which may not be their first language. um and the thing about English as a language is that it is now a global language, right? English only had a very tiny temporal window before it left the shores of England itself. And once it leaves England, especially now after centuries of colonization, English is no longer England's language alone. English is both you and I's first language, but I mean, it's been in our countries for like ages and ages, and it's not been tied to England or England's soil. So I think that that's just an interesting thought for anybody to keep in mind when they're considering, you know, the way that Tolkien wanted these things to be tied not just to the cultural aspect of the soil but also to the linguistic aspect of English, because English is no longer the language that belongs to just one country. It belongs to countries all across the globe at this point.
And it could be said at the point that he wrote the books as well. Um, it's not it's
100%.
not even like, oh, this is a modern take from 2021. Like, no, colonization had already happened. England had its fingers in a whole bunch of different pots. Like, this country is literally everywhere by the time Tolkien is writing the Silmarillion. So I think that was a wonderful discussion. Thank you for all of your insights. Uh,
Yeah, and you as well. Let's move on to the Ainulindalë.
Dale.
Dale, vámonos. Okay, so I think a really good way to do this would be to begin with a synopsis for people who may not be reading along.
So basically, the Ainulindalë. This is the beginning of the book, and there's God, Eru, Iluvatar, the elvish gods of men, whatever you want to call him, and Homie makes his other homies. Like, he literally makes them out of his head, and they start singing because I guess that's what homies do. But then one homie, Melkor, he didn't like the song, and he wanted to sing his own version of things. And Edu's like, my guy, you can go ahead and you can sing that. But like for like a minute. And then after he was like, nah, fam, you gotta stop singing. And he's like, I will literally fight you on this. And by fight, I mean, let's have a sing off in front of all of our other homies. And so you have like Edu Beyonce on the other side, and he's like, perfect Fern voice.
I see fire inside the mountain. I see fire. Yeah.
And then on the other side, there's Melkor slash like literally any 80s trash metal artist. And he's like, I am Melkor, man. I will take anything that I can. And, like riffing on his guitar and shit. It's really, really bad. And Edu essentially like keeps doing this, like sing off with him until he decides enough is enough and literally cuts the mics and wins. Then he says, in front of all of the homies, you suck, and I'm gonna cover all of your songs, and they're gonna be way better, and you'll never make a Grammy. And, like, this makes Melkor upset, but he's like, all right, I lost. And for whatever reason, Eru is just like, all right, we're gonna watch the music video of the songs the homies made. And they do, and they see all of Arda happening in this music video. And then Eru, the little shit he is, cuts it off right before the War of the Rings, is like, right, let's get to work. And that's basically the beginning of the creation of Arda.
That was beautiful. I nominate you for a Grammy. Best spoken word.
Best spoken word.
Well, there you have it. That is at least the beginning of the creation of Arda. Hopefully our summary made more sense than whatever you might have just read. The Ainulindalë is notoriously difficult to get into. It's really metaphysical. It's very abstract in many ways. And there's just a lot going on there in terms of like spiritual elements and everything. Which I guess is something we can talk a little bit about. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of spiritual elements. At least, like, even the first line, as soon as you start reading the music of Ainur, you have Eru, and he literally makes the Ainur from his thought, like from his head. And that is really reminiscent of Zeus and the Greek pantheon creating Athena from his head as well. And the whole pantheon of gods in general, with the creator god, is really reminiscent of a lot of different religions across the world.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, the link to the Greek pantheon. It's very true. And also I think the one cannot discount the aspect of, Christian myths. And I say this just because like I read the Paradise Lost like a few too many times. And like so many aspects of the way that this creation myth works, and the way that like, that Melkor is like almost a Luciferian figure, that definitely plays into this entire chapter as well.
Not just that, but there's a reference, very early on in the chapter where, after the Ainur have harmonized for the first time and they create this beautiful music, it's said that their music is never that beautiful again until the end of days. And I think that the way that they describe this end of days is really like revelations, and to go outside of the Silmarillion, the end of days in the world of Arda is
Yeah, it's very much like it's like Revelations, and it's also like Ragnarok in many ways. I think that the first time that I sort of understood the way that it would play out, it reminded me a lot of Ragnarok in the sense that well, spoiler alert, Melkor gets he basically gets cast out into the void at the end of the events of the Silmarillion, and he's stuck there until the end of days when the guard will fall asleep and he will return into the world to destroy it. And for me, that just it's so reminiscent of like Loki getting chained up by the gods, just like Melkor, who he also gets chained up and thrown out into the void. Loki gets chained up to a rock, uh and then at the end of days, like he'll be released and he'll sail back to Asgard, and then everybody will fight and it'll be destroyed. And that's very reminiscent to what will happen here. But then you have that Christian element that takes over for the end of days, because the idea of with Revelations, as you were saying, V, is that the world will be destroyed, but then there will be a new world. They'll be reborn to like some sort of paradise presided over by God or by Christ. And that seems to be the idea of this second great music that will come, like the music, as you said, well, this is as great as it is going to be until the end of days, and then it'll be greater. So yeah, it's really interesting.
so you have already, we were talking about the British English myth before, and how, Tolkien is already referencing all of these different cultures. Well, let's talk about Melkor, because Melkor is, one of the central characters of the First Age. It's his comings and goings that kind of make the First Age as part of this mythology, is directly because of his actions here at the beginning, at the creation. um so what about Melkor?
After this whole thing didn't go well with him trying to make his own music, he went off into the void, right? Like actually
I think
he
he
it was
went
his
out to the
going
void before, didn't he?
before, exactly, yeah, he went out before, and that's where he got this idea of creating his own music. And I guess it's the idea of him staring too long into the abyss, and then it starts to stare back into him. It's very, very he's very emo. It's really fascinating because what he was looking for out there was this creative spark, right? Was the flame imperishable? It's not a creative force in and of itself. He cannot be a god because the flame resides with Eru, but he was looking for that and he couldn't find it. And I think that being so far away from everybody else and like being out in the void and not finding this and seeking this only, I guess that completely warped his thought. So yeah, so then we have Melkor. He's back and he's making all his like terrible music. And I guess the interesting thing to talk about now is what Eru does in response to Melkor coming back.
Yeah, Eru, to be honest, is kind of fucked up. I think you said it earlier about the if God, why evil debate. And it really does read, like, just from the text itself, that Eru kind of allows this to happen. He sees Melkor's radicalization. He even sits there and listens while Melkor goes off on his little off key singing or whatever he's doing. He sits there and he waits until suddenly he's like, okay, this is enough. Why does he wait? And also, we speak of Eru, and Eru is kind of like this omnipresent being. He knows what's going to happen until the end of days because he shows everyone what's going to happen until the end of days, up until the War of the Ring, which he purposefully cuts them off from seeing. So that kind of makes you wonder about his motivations. To me, he's not really a benevolent god. He's not like this great, peaceful creator. It seemed almost chaotic because he's allowing Melkor to sow these seeds, and then essentially he's like, "All right, my guy, you can make things bad, but then I will come in and make them better." It's like he needs Melkor to do these evil things to then be the great benevolent god that he is. And I think that's really interesting because I know that's not something a lot of people talk about.
100%. Yeah, it's not something that they talk about. It's something that's also really, it's always sat uncomfortably with me because basically it's the cosmological role that Melkor has been given to play is as the fall guy. He's the guy who has to, the like Melkor has to exist so that there can be this dichotomy between what is good and what is not. It's very uncomfortable. And what you were saying about things cutting off, he didn't just cut things off, right? Because it's also mentioned that there's also things that he did not show them even within that timeline that he did show them. There are small gaps in it, things that are unexpected. And I'm thinking of moments when Eru has like intervention in the world, or moments where the Valar themselves were shocked by something that occurred, like for example Numenor, that was completely out of their control. Eru himself had to intervene, but the thing is, because he is this omnipresent, omniscient god, he would have known that that's going to happen. So, like, it's really uncomfortable. And I hate to quote Hannibal Lecter, but I can't help thinking of his quote from the TV series where he says, "God loves to kill, he does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?" You know? And Melkor is one of the children that is created in his image as the springing of his thought. Melkor, the bad, and all the other Valar, the good. They are all Eru, and yet the way this is framed is that Melkor is like some other thing beyond him, and yet Eru says that everything you do has its source in me. Everything you do has its source in me. And it's something that sits so uncomfortably for me just because of the framing. If this is what the creator god is, if he's meant to be this amoral figure, that's like, I would be more comfortable with that. But it's the dichotomous framing and basically pinning this one being with this convoluted cosmological role that you have to be the fall guy, you have to be the Lucifer of this narrative, because we need to distinguish between what is bad and what is good. It's I don't know, man. It's messy.
It's
It's
messy.
messy.
It's kind of. I remember what we do before these episodes is we actually read the stories to each other. And as we were reading it, I read the part where like Eru is like, "Yeah, man," and I was like, "That's fucked up."
Yeah,
That was my first
literally.
response. I was like, "That is fucked up," and it kind of is because you have like this sense of balance. Like there has to be a balance somewhere, and it's like this fake sense of balance with Eru because he controls everything. So it's really interesting to look at his motivations because he's not just this creator. He's so much more than that.
Absolutely. It's just fascinating to see the way that he explains his logic, or at least the way that the elves transmit to us through the Silmarillion how Eru explains his logic. It's really interesting. And you can say all sorts of things, if you want to go off on a separate tangent, which we won't go too far into, but I've just been thinking about, the fact that Tolkien's frame narrative is the Silmarillion, is the elves writing down these histories, right? And that's how we're reading them. And so you wonder to what extent were Eru's motivations filtered through that lens in this universe of the story. It's a whole other tangent, but I think it's also something really interesting to for our listeners to consider.
And that's only really the beginning
Yeah,
of of the chapter, because then we go on to like the literal actual creation of Arda, where Eru takes his secret flame and like throws it out into the void, and he's like, "Hey guys, if you want to go get it, you can go get it." and some of the Ainur, they're like, hell yeah, we're gonna go out and we're gonna see our children of Iluvatar. We're gonna, play with them because they're like little pets. We love them so much, and they get there and they're like, oh shit, this doesn't exist yet.
There ain't nothing there.
They're not there. You mean we actually have to build this first? Which it wasn't really an issue. They were just kind of like surprised at first, and then they really got into it. And of course, who goes along with them to start creating things? Our boy Melkor, who's having some feelings, it's having some thoughts. Like it speaks like in the chapter, he's like, after he was completely shut down by Eru in front of all of, the homies, he feels bad. He feels shameful for what he did. He feels like, oh, there's something wrong with me. And he pretends that he wants to be part of this creation. He pretends that he wants to be there for Eru and his kin. And he goes on with it for a little while until they actually start creating in Arda.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then once they start creating, that's where it gets interesting as well, because he sees he sees this realm that's starting to get created. I think who was creating with it? It was Manwe, Ulmo, and Aule, who were the three of them that were working really hard, and Melkor was there too. But he just goes up to this place and he's like, haha, I claim it. This is gonna be mine, and I'm gonna call it Melkor World. And then obviously they're like, no, and then he gets mad. And it's just really interesting the manifest actions that he takes, just on the creation myth perspective, because it mimics the actual geological processes in our earth, right? Because it talks about how, they raise up mountains and then Melkor throws them down, they make seas, and then he spills them. It's interesting because you can sort of understand on the emotive level why Melkor is doing what he does, because he's acting on these like impulses, but also it's like ridiculous because it's just like a toddler throwing a hissy fit. He's knocking over the blocks, he's spilling everybody's sippy cups, like that's what he's doing. And I just love his visible description in this part of the Ainulindalë as well, because he goes into the world and all of the Valar are taking on like visible forms, right? Their raiments. And like Melkor is described as like I think it was like a mountain that wades in the sea, that's like crowned in ice and shadow, in smoke and fire. And it is very cool. It is extremely impressive, and you get this. It's just this whole cosmological scale that you get exposed to in this chapter. It's very interesting once it starts manifesting in Arda itself, and the way that you see it start to become less of this abstract like spiritual like creation, and it starts to actually take place, and these great conflicts between the way that Melkor sees his role in creation, and Manwe and Olmo and Aule and all the other Valar see their role in creation. It starts to actually play out in the physical world that the children are then going to inhabit. It's very, very cool part
Yeah, I
of the
agree.
story.
I really like it. And there's like this one little tidbit that's there as they're talking about Melkor and his imagery and like, how he chose to like put himself, like how he chose to physically show himself in this new world of Arda, which they also said, was a manifestation of his emotions, was a manifestation of his jealousy and his like need and entitlement and all of this stuff, which is why he's pictured in such a dark, like cataclysmic way compared to, Manwe, who's the guy in the sky, and Ulmo, who makes the sea, which is the prettiest thing that's ever existed in the entire world. Aule, he has, all of these pretty gold substances, silver, all of the like elements, he creates those. And then you have Melkor, who's having this crisis, um, because he has been radicalized by the void, because he has all these thoughts and beings, he doesn't know how to control them. He has literally no impulse control. But anyways, all of this manifests and it creates, his monstrous form, which sounds pretty sick. It looks like a Dark Souls character. If you play video games, he looks cool in this imagining of this description. But also there's this really nice tidbit where Tolkien says, even as with us male and female, maybe be shown by the raiment, but is not made thereby.
V, did Tolkien just say trans rights?
Tolkien might have just said trans rights.
We love to see it. We love. No, I have to say that like it just speaks to me so much more like now as somebody who's a Tolkien fan and who's like non-binary. I love that. I love this acknowledgement that the outer role or like the way that the physical world presents a person is not necessarily the essence of their soul. And I just love that. I love that it's such an unexpected thing to find in like Tolkien's work, but the fact that it exists and that it's there, it's in black and white, and it's the Valar, it's the powers of the world. I think that's just beautiful.
I think it was one of the more like, oh wow, did that just happen type moments that we had while we were reading this. And it was really nice to see that, especially like at the end of the chapter, because this chapter does end when Melkor goes off on everyone and they have this war. They literally battle it out, as you said earlier, with, you know, mountains are being crumbled down, seas are being spilled out, like this really big reconstruction and deconstruction of the world until it kind of settles down, and that's where we get the Valaquenta.
Exactly. So the Valaquenta, basically, it's just a repetition of the Ainulindalë in further detail because the Silmarillion is a scrapbook of lore. I kind of love the way it starts because it's very clear that from the beginning, Melkor is no longer a homie. It's just like, you can't sit with us. There are like 8 Valar, and then there is a ninth. Like, they don't even name him when they describe. They're just like, yeah, like the 8 Valar, and then a ninth one.
It's important to like recognize at this point it really is, you know, the story that the Eldar get, the elves.
Mm hmm.
It's their interpretation of the events that happened just before that we just went over. And yeah, they kick Melkor out, and in fact, they hate him so much, and they're so fearful of him. They don't call him Melkor anymore.
No.
They call him Morgoth. I don't know how much more goth he could get with his little, you know, tantrum going on and dark and evil and all right, but they say, you know what?
We're just gonna
Morgoth.
make him more
That's his
goth,
name.
more goth.
No, no, but the Valakentha goes into, you know, like the roles of the Valar on in Arda and what they're creating and their relationships and stuff like that. It's intro to the Elvish Gods 101.
Basically, exactly. So shall we talk about the gods? Shall we start off with the big boy, the OG, the supposed king of Arda, Manwë?
Manwë and his big
His big
arms.
arms. Which interestingly is not quite accurate because he's slightly less powerful, isn't he? He's not the. It said that Melkor is the one who had the greatest gifts or the powers from Eru, and yet Manwë is like, I guess, second best, but he's homies with Eru, and so he gets to be king of the world because he's a good guy.
He is a good guy. He is a good guy, though, and like that's the thing. And it's kind of funny because Manwë and Melkor are kind of like, to Eru, they are kin, like they are actually brothers. They're closest in power.
Hmm.
Melkor being the eldest, you know, like the eldest child, you don't want to inherit the kingdom, so you get it to, you know, the youngest pretty son, which is essentially happens here with Manwë. But then there's another aspect of it, their brotherly relationship that's really interesting, and that's the introduction of Varda.
Yes. Varda she's into Manwë and his big arms and his solid personality and the fact that he's like an actual stand-up Vala. And she gets with him. Varda and Manwë are a thing, and it's fascinating because that pisses Melkor off. But so he hates Varda, but he's also really scared of her, which I think is fascinating.
He it's like he asked her out and she's like, fuck no, and she goes off with his brother instead. And I love that this being who is this, you know, female cosmological lights and stars and everything, she is the queen of Arda and she's beloved by the elves, is she is the one that puts all of this anger and hatred in him, yet he can't even look at her, he can't, she took that power away from him, and I love that.
Yeah, me too. He becomes such a pathetic figure with her as a contrast to him. It's amazing. I just think it's wonderful looking at all the different ways that I have to be honest that like ladies in the Legendarium just hand his ass to him again and again and again. And it starts with Varda, and we'll get it like later on with a whole bunch of other characters with Ungoliant. the amazing Eldritch Spider Lady, and with Luthien as well. It's wonderful, and I think it just like hammers home the point of how like desperate and pathetic and like shamed and shameful this creature of Melkor is, that these beautiful, wonderful, fantastic beings of light, he cannot exert power over them. They take that privilege away from him, or that right, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it so much. And then you get into Ulmo, who is, he is kind of like this Poseidon figure. He always hangs out in the water. He also has a very, very sick description. Whenever he does come up to the Valinor, nobody likes it when he comes up because he literally shows up as, again, kind of like a Dark Souls character that you have to fight. He's like in mail, he's really big, and he has this booming voice, but he's also a really nice guy, like super nice. Like he shows up in Middle Earth and he starts singing to people. He listens to all of the creatures of Middle Earth and like finds out their problems and reports them to Valinor. And he's the goth kid you want to be.
Yeah.
He doesn't have any of this anger that Melkor has. He's just kind of this loner kid who's kind of separate from all the other Valar, but
Mhm.
he likes that, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Um,
I think it's great to have a god that's like that, because I think, you find in a lot of pantheons that a lot of gods, like they tend to exist like in their social circles. Like they'll have like a spouse, or they'll have like siblings or whatever, and they'll like actively be involved in that. But I think the nice thing about Ulmo is that he's just kind of doing his own thing in the sea, and he's like actively looking out for like the children, and like they know that. I think that's quite a beautiful thing. That's why as sad as the concept of sea longing is, they speak in the description of Ulmo about his horns, the great conches that of the music that he makes, and the fact that the music of the Ainur, like it's said to linger in the sea, um, and the children hearken to it, and they know not for what they listen. I think it's very beautiful, and it definitely gives the sense of Olmo being a Vala that's very much more involved in the world, despite keeping so much to himself. He seems to give a lot more than you expect him to give.
I love it. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And also, like, as you look at Manwë, as you look at Urmo, as you look at Varda and Aule, as we're gonna get into next, they're in direct contrast to Melkor. And you don't really like, the more that the Valaquenta goes over these other gods, the more you see how completely out of pocket Melkor is and how really pathetic he is in terms of this group of beings.
He's just so selfish and bitter and destructive, honestly. You look at the way that these other Valar are choosing to engage in the world, and the way he's choosing to engage it, it reminds me of like the most toxic people I've ever known in my life. Just the way that he feels he's entitled to things.
It gets so bad that like they say that he can no longer create. He
Yeah.
can't create anymore. All he can do is lie and steal and destroy. Like he really has become like this destructive force. And we see that a lot with Aule, as they describe Aule, because Aule is the one who's creating this earth. And Melkor, that's also something that he created. And Aule and Melkor are very similar as far as their creation. They want to create, they want to make things. Aule is a smith. He is a creator. He is the creator besides Eru, he's a craftsman, is what I mean to say. And Melkor is kind of the same. Like he has that power as well, and he wants to make his own things. The difference between Aule and Melkor is that Aule doesn't need that recognition.
Yeah, no, it's true. He likes creating things, and he's happy with that creation, and he's happy to let the work stand for itself. One thing that like distinguishes the two of them is that Melkor has this need to have absolute control over like whatever is being created or whatever he's creating, because like the entirety of like Ea of creation is, it's a collaborative effort, and no one being has dominion over the world, because that belongs with Eru, who has the flame imperishable. And that goes back to Melkor not being able to attain this godlike creative power that resides solely with the creator, and he's unable to accept this fact that in this world, in his existence, with this lot that he's been given, he can make the choice to be part of this collaborative effort, to be a positive force, to find satisfaction in using his skills the way that Aule does. But he doesn't because he wants to control, he wants to be able to subjugate, essentially. And that just corrupts him. He just devolves.
And I think that part of it is also that he's jealous of Aule. He's
Yeah.
jealous that Aule can be content with what's going on, because Aule is, a mirror image of him, except he is just like, my guy, we're here to build things for Eru, and I'm okay with that. I love the children of Iluvatar. I want to create things for them. And Melkor just can't have that. He has no impulse control. He
Yeah.
doesn't have what Aule has, and that drives him insane. It drives him insane with everyone. He doesn't have the capacity for that, and it makes me wonder if Eru made him like that specifically, as we talked about before, because something has to go wrong for a character to end up so far gone
Mm.
than his peers and his kin.
Yeah, and if you're created at the beginning of time, like, honestly, there's only one source as to where that could have gone wrong, really, if you're a primordial being. So it's, yeah, it goes back to that unanswerable question, I guess, which is, what is the will of God? And we as humans, I don't think we'll ever know. And I don't think even the professor can give us that answer. Um, so shall we talk about Vaire, or Vaire the Weaver?
Yes, that also kind of speaks into Eru as well, because you have this Weaver character that's kind of like the Fates, but she's really only a recorder of what has happened in Arda up until now. But her imagery speaks of someone who takes charge of what's happening in
Mm.
Arda.
Yeah, and that's quite that also sort of plays into the way that Namo works as well, right? Because he's the doomsman who he gives his dooms and his, like, prophecies, essentially. But he also doesn't really know how everything's going to play out in the end, does he? Because Eru cut off that vision of what is going to happen in Arda during the events of the War of the Ring and beyond. So he also sort of, like, he's kind of like within that role as well of, if Vaire is like the fate that looks at the past, then Mandos or Namo is sort of the fate that looks towards the future. But neither of them really have that full control, because Eru is the one who's pulling the strings, pulling the threads of fate. And, like, it's cool that you bring up the idea of the fates in general, because I think, like, when we talk about Namo, who is Vaire's husband, and who is kind of like the god that's presiding over the halls of the dead. It's very interesting, just the fact that, like, his realm is Mandos, his name is Namo, but the name Mandos gets conflated with the god himself. And for me personally, that kind of reminded me of Hades. So the way that the name of place is conflated with the name of the god, because you have, Hades, who's the god of the underworld, but also, you would say you go down to Hades, you go down to the underworld. I thought it was just another cool parallel with these guys and this other pantheon. So let's that was really cool. Let's talk about Nienna, because I think Nienna's really interesting when it comes to the moral or the kind of philosophical underpinnings that we get really strong echoes of in the Lord of the Rings as well.
So you have Nienna, and she's sorrow, but she's also wisdom. She's kind of, queen of grief, and she takes on her palace is in the very west of Valinor, at the very edges of the world, by the Hall of Mandel, so the dead are and everything. And it's interesting because she is the one who influences Gandalf the most, who, as a Maiar, his name is Oloin. He kind of echoes a lot of her sentiments throughout the Lord of the Rings, as Fern was saying. We see her in the melancholy of the world. We see her in Gandalf's messages to do what you have with the time that you have to do it with. You see her in, the beginning and ending of Beautiful Things, and a lot of people, obviously, like, this resonates with them because there is grief in our own world and there's loss in our own world, and she kind of has this wisdom about it, like, do not
Mm.
despair entirely, because there's always hope even in endings and death.
Absolutely, absolutely. I find that a lot of the sentiments that she has and that, get transmitted to us through Gandalf are sentiments that I'm finding a lot of courage with, especially now at the time that we're recording this. It's March 2021 for posterity. So this is a time when I think a lot of us are dealing with with a lot of the same themes that seem to resonate in Tolkien's world. The idea of, I wish this need not have happened in my time. And the fact that, a lot of these things are out of our control, and a lot of the loss that is in our world is also, woven into the themes of that world of Middle Earth and of Arda of their creation. Mourning is woven into the very fabric of Arda. And that doesn't have to be the be all and end all of, of the world, because as you said, as we can choose what to do with the time that's given to us, so we can choose how we process our grief and how we learn from it and become wiser through it, and through our memories, and pay that forward into the future, and work for better ends. And I think in a way that's quite, that sort of is maybe a nice fact that the Valar, their vision cuts off at the War of the Ring, because it really means that those choices bear so much more weight when there are, the powers basically, the best they can do at that point is just to advise and share this wisdom, so that the sorrow of the world doesn't consume the people that, now have no prophecies with which to approach it. So I think she is definitely a goddess for our times.
She really is. I really like her inclusion. Honestly, all of the Valier are really beautiful, beautiful, and well written. And I do wish that some of this context of these beautiful, strong characters who present female were also in the Lord of the Rings.
I mean, especially because they've had such a strong influence. They're in the background. They may like show up through what Gandalf says, but it's a shame that we don't know that this came from Nienna.
Yeah, and that would have been really nice. Like we speak of Varda as, Elbereth like all of the time, but you don't even really know
Yeah.
who that is or what she represents in a lot of ways. And I think Nienna is so much more pervasive throughout the rest of the story, from beginning to end, even in The Hobbit,
Yeah.
through Bilbo's experiences to the Lonely Mountain. She is there as well through Gandalf. So I think that's a really interesting character that we don't get to see, much of. You know, uh, I'm kind of sad now after thinking about Nienna, and it really does bring back all those feelings of reading The Lord of the Rings and feeling all this bittersweet, like melancholy throughout the book. It does bring up feelings of both, in real life situations and also what the characters are experiencing in the book. But luckily, the next Valar we get to speak about is Turkas,
Tolga's my
and
man.
his only characterization is that he really, really likes to beat people up. He really likes to fight. He's always about to,
He's ready to throw hands at any given
at
moment.
any given moment. He is just a beefcake. They even say that he's not a counselor. Don't go for him to advise because he will just tell you,
Beat them
beat the
up.
shit out of
Yeah.
them. Like,
Oh,
I
Tolgas.
really enjoyed his character
Yeah.
though.
It was just
Just
fun.
because it's fun.
Yeah.
We really like it.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the Valar. We didn't go over all of them, but just some of the ones that really stood out to us and resonated with us. And that brings us to the next section, which is of the Maiar. And we start with a really interesting one, who is Osse, who is a Maya of Ulmo. And Osse is very interesting because he is one of the Maiar that in the initial stages is sympathetic to Melkor, and Melkor kind of goes after him. What do you think about that, V?
I think it's interesting, with Oss's character because they do say, he is kind of rebellious. He is kind of angry. He kind of has a lot of the stuff that Melkor had originally before he devolved into the creature that is Morgoth. And Osse is kind of able to be seduced by Morgoth to join his cause, because that's one of the first people that he goes to looking for assistance, especially because Ase is like the protege of Ulmo, and Ulmo controls the sea. So you have Melkor Morgoth being like, if you join me, you can rule the seas instead. And when you already have a guy that's kind of like, who's kind of rebellious, who's kind of like, what if I could do it? Because I'm doing it anyways. Why shouldn't I get that title? Why shouldn't I get that responsibility? Um,
And I
it
think
makes you think a little.
it does. And I also think it's also a really interesting Maya for him to go for in the first place, because it's mentioned that Melkor hates and fears the sea. And who does that sound like? Another Vala who he hates and fears. And it's again because he cannot control the sea. It is so wide and it is so chaotic. So what does he do? He cannot exert control over it. He cannot create something that contests the sea. So he corrupts it. That's always his go-to strategy. He cannot do anything about it, so he corrupts. So he goes for the one who is, the most after his own heart, and decides to try and exert control over him. But I think one the cool part about that story is the way then that Ulmo sends Uinen, another Maya, to go and basically, speak to Ose and calm him, and she basically like becomes his wife. And it just continues the trend of ladies like destroying Melkor's plans as usual.
Yeah,
Like
thwarting Melkor. It's a lady's gift. Um,
we need that on a t-shirt.
yeah, it's really cool. Oinen, Ose's wife, is really the voice of reason in
Hmm.
their relationship, and that's probably why they work so well. Is he kind of has all these chaotic impulses that we see in Melkor, but he also has somebody who's able to work through them with him. He has a support, and he's able to kind of jump back from the ledge. He's able to step back from the ledge, and he repents to Ormo, and he's able to take up his mantle again. Because that's also like, this is an insane breach of trust. You're speaking with this ancient evil that has literally been kicked out of the group because he has caused so many problems, and you're thinking about joining him. That, like, if I was Ulmo, I'd be like, oh my gosh,
Hmm.
what? And so it's really cool that he does have this support, this voice of reason, and it's very cool that once again a female presenting character says "fuck you" to Morgoth. But then we go on to another important Maiar, probably the most important Maiar in Tolkien, and I'm going to give this to Fern because already I can see their face. I know they're so ready to talk about this. Their favorite character in the whole wide world. Who is this Maiar we're speaking of?
He's just this little, not very well known character named Sauron. um, like, okay, I love this guy because he's so interesting. He's such a fascinating figure in this entire cosmic drama that's taking place. We know he fell really early on, and it's absolutely fascinating because in this part of the Valaquenta, it's spoken about how in every deed of Melkor, Sauron had a part. He's like in there from the beginning, and he's only less evil in the sense that he served Melkor first rather than himself, which obviously changes later on. But right now, he is still second in command. And it is fascinating because he is, for somebody who works so closely with Melkor, he is quite a different character. He's very crafty, he's very intelligent, powerful, and resourceful. But he is answerable to a higher figure. And it's just a really good contrast with Melkor, because we spoke earlier about how Melkor, he tends to act on emotion first, right? He acts on jealousy, he acts on hatred, um, and this warps him and makes him resentful, unable to look at things objectively, and just lash out. But with Sauron, we seem to get this idea that his motivation is about having dominion over things, right? He wants to rule things. You can't rule over the ashes, you know? You have to have something that you can subjugate. And unlike Melkor, who wants to subjugate things but can't do it, so he destroys it, like Sauron actually actively seems to know how to do the practicalities, and to endure through everything that Middle Earth is going to throw at them in order to, like, to keep his slaves, to build his towers, to have his kingdom, to rule all the lands. And it's just this kind of like practicality that is a fascinating counterpoint to Morgoth's chaos.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that Sauron is Aule's prodigy. Like
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
is second under Aule. He learns from this craftsmith. He is a smith himself. He is a creator himself. So you have that aspect in it as well. And I'm wondering if maybe that's where he gets that discipline, because in order to
Mhm.
create things from nothingness, in order to create control, you have to do it with discipline that Melkor does not have.
100%. Yeah. It takes discipline, and it takes respect for what you're working with. And respect, maybe not in the sense of reverence, because there is a difference between the two. But I think that also manifests in the way he treats the world, right? Because there's a sense of valuing whatever it is that you're dealing with. Just because you didn't make that initial creative element, like, I don't know, the raw gold that you're going to smith into a ring or something, you know just, like, subtly, in case anybody wants to do that at any point in the timeline.
Don't forget it was raw gold and malice, wherever
uh,
that comes from.
Raw gold and malice, exactly. Anybody know where I can, like, mine some malice? I want to, like, sell it on the market. Well, basically, yeah, like, as you say, I think it takes a sense of discipline, a sense of respect for what you're working with. But I also feel that in getting involved with Morgoth, Sauron does and will progressively lose that sense of any kind of respect for what he's working with, because he starts as this creative entity, as this Maya of Aule, where he can put that work to good use. He can have that creative power, and it's said he remains admirable in the lore of Aule's people, right? Because what he was doing and what he was capable of at the time. Like, he was it's like Elrond said at the Council of Elrond, nothing is evil in the beginning, even Sauron was not so. And it's so, like, depressing. It's so sad to see this potential that gets completely wasted because he decides that, I'm also not satisfied. This lack of satisfaction with creating something and then letting it go, which Aule is completely capable of. And for some reason, Sauron cannot do that because he is unable. He loves order and he loves control, and he loves he doesn't like to waste things. And I guess there's the sense that, once you create something and it's out of your hands, like, that's not something he can deal with. And so he seems to find his answer with Morgoth, and that's why he would, I guess, gets involved with him, becomes his lieutenant, because then Morgoth can give him the power to not just create things but then to control them, to exert some sort of, like, subjugative force over them. And it's just like, it's so sad, man. Like, I think that just entirely corrupts his entire, like, creative power as a Maya, as an Ainu, because as you progressively get further in the legendarium, like, his entire being, it just continues to, like, disintegrate and get worse. He will talk about this as we read the book, but he loses his ability to take on a fair raiment. He puts his soul into the ring, and, like, that completely fucks him up as well. And then, by the time you get to Lord of the Rings, like, where is this creative power? It's gone. This Maya that has once been had so much potential with Aule is just completely devolved. He has, to quote the last line of the enemies in the Valaquenta, followed his master down the same ruinous path into the void. And it's just, oof. It is a beautiful bit of cosmic tragedy, and that's why I love the guy.
We could definitely tell you love him so much. I feel like Sauron ends up doing it better because of all that we discussed here. Sauron, becomes the second coming of darkness like 3 different times. He really does put his abilities to use. And I wonder how much of that he got from Morgoth. And that'll be interesting to look at as we read through the first and second ages of Arda, of Middle Earth.
100%. Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see, I guess, like, where the transition happens between him being, a lieutenant doing something at a master's bidding, and where that starts to change, and he starts to, I guess, develop the mindset or the skills or the personal philosophy to become a lord in his own right, where that shift happens. I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see, because I agree, he outlasted Morgoth. I think that you get these debates a lot in fan communities as well. I thought it was I have to bring this up. It was very funny when the synopsis for the new Amazon Prime TV series Lord of the Rings was released, and it's set in the Second Age, so this is beyond Morgoth's time. Sauron is the regnant Dark Lord, and he was referred to in the synopsis as the greatest evil that Middle Earth has ever faced. And so many fans got so butthurt about that, and were just like, "Oh my god, you didn't read the Silmarillion. Morgoth is the most powerful." And I was just like, "No, no, 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 no. This is the thing. We're not talking about most powerful here, right? We're talking about greatest. We're talking about the greatest evil." And in my opinion, like, Morgoth may have put all of this darkness into the world, but if we're talking about who actually fucked up Arda for the longest time, just consistently messing with everybody, it wasn't really Morgoth. I just gotta say, he wasn't that effective after a certain point.
Not only does he become, less effective after being thrown into the fucking void, he also only really influenced the Valar and, the Eldar at the beginning. Like, Morgoth's reign was effectively short. And you have Sauron, who fucks with the elves, he fucks with the men, he fucks with the hobbits, he fucks with all the creatures of Middle Earth, he fucks with the people from the east and from the south. He really messes a lot of things up in his reign of terror, and that's what it is, because that's what he wants. He doesn't want dominion through destruction. He wants dominion through control. So he effectively makes it possible for people to exist, but in the most excruciating circumstances possible under, his rule. Like, that's his whole point. He wants everyone to be miserable, and he wants punishment of the earth through his cruelty. And he can do that. And that's so much scarier than Morgoth, who just kills you dead.
Exactly. Like, it's only so scary up to a point. The scary thing about Sauron is the way that he just lasts. He lasts whatever, like, the free peoples of Middle Earth try and throw at him to destroy him. It takes so fucking long to get rid of him. It's very insidious the way that he is able to influence people, especially because, unlike Morgoth, a lot of his tactics do not involve just brute force break things. He knows how to manipulate people. I definitely think that his brand of evil reminds me way more of the kinds of evil that you see in our world than Morgoth's. And I think that is why he is a character that is also so fascinating to me, because I can see shades of things that I have seen or experienced in my life in this character and in his policies and in the way that he tries to exert dominion over the world.
And I think with that, we are going to end the first episode of the Silly-meme-rillion of Rereading. Next week, we'll be going over chapters 1 and 2 of the Silmarillion proper. That's going to be the beginning of Days and of Aule and Yavanna. So we look forward to hearing your feedback. We look forward to seeing your comments.
And with that, we would just say stay tuned, and we will see you next week. Namarie.